T.E. Lawrence, The Unbroken and the Broken. Chapter 1. Lawrence of Arabia, an epic journey through desert, war, and destiny. Successes. The road stretched empty ahead, winding through the green countryside of Dorset like a ribbon through a forgotten world. May 13th, 1935. The morning air tasted clean, ordinary, the kind of morning that promises nothing except the gentle passage of hours. A man guided a motorcycle along this road, a Brough Superior SS-100, the machine purring beneath him like a living thing. He was small, compact, his body bearing the scars of 1,000 desert miles. The wind pushed against his face, and for a moment, just one breath, there was peace. Then the dip in the road, two boys on bicycles, appearing like ghosts from behind the rise, the swerve, the loss of control, the handlebars twisting, the world spinning, blood on pavement, silence where an engine had been singing. 6 days later, Thomas Edward Lawrence, scholar, warrior, legend, would surrender to the darkness in a military hospital, never having opened his eyes again. He was 46 years old, the man they called Lawrence of Arabia, who had united warring tribes and toppled empires, who had ridden into Damascus at the head of an army, died on a quiet English road trying to avoid 2 children on bicycles. But this is not where the story begins. This is only where it ends. To understand the final ride, you must first understand the first breath, the birth of a man who would spend his entire life running from one truth and toward another. Chapter 2. Born into Shadows. August 16th, 1888. A child entered the world in Tremedock, Wales, in a house that would later be renamed Snowdon Lands. The second of 5 sons, a baby who should not have existed, at least not in the eyes of Victorian society's rigid morality, because Thomas Edward Lawrence was born of sin, or so the world would have judged it. His father was Sir Thomas Chapman, an Anglo-Irish baronet who had inherited estates in Ireland, wealth, and a title that stretched back generations. His mother was Sarah Junner, the governess Chapman had hired to care for his legitimate daughters. Somewhere in those quiet halls, in stolen moments between duty and desire, something happened. Chapman abandoned his wife, his title's respectability, his social standing. He ran. And Sarah ran with him. They could not marry. Chapman's wife refused him a divorce. So they simply pretended. They changed their surname to Lawrence. They moved from place to place like fugitives. Wales, Scotland, the island of Jersey, the coast of Brittany, the New Forest. Always moving, always one step ahead of discovery. By 1896, they finally settled in Oxford, where the university's intellectual atmosphere might offer some cover for a family living in what the world called sin. Young Thomas Edward, known to his family as Ned, learned to read at 4 years old, simply by listening to his older brother and copying him. By 6, he was studying Latin. The mind behind those blue eyes absorbed everything, retained everything. But what he absorbed most deeply was the weight of his birth, the knowledge that he and his brothers were illegitimate, that their very existence was a scandal his parents spent their lives concealing. This truth became an anchor around his neck, dragging him down even as he soared. All his life, Lawrence would struggle with honor, with shame, with the gap between what the world saw and what he knew himself to be. He built walls around his inner self, learned dissimulation, developed a habit of secrecy that would follow him into the desert onto the desert. His mother, Sarah, was a force, religious, controlling, determined to raise her sons with iron discipline. Some sources suggest she beat them, attempting to instill morality through pain. Lawrence's relationship with her was tortured. He cared for her, wrote to her constantly, yet seemed to resent her scrutiny, her questions, a need to know his thoughts. In response, he became unknowable. He learned to hide himself in plain sight. His father was different, quieter, passing on his love of cycling and photography to young Ned. But the knowledge of his father's heavy drinking, his abandonment of one family for another, left its mark. Perhaps this is why Lawrence became a teetotaler, never touching alcohol. Perhaps this is why he spent his life testing himself, pushing beyond normal limits, as if trying to prove he was nothing like the man who gave him life. At Oxford High School, the boy stood out. Small for his age, he would never grow taller than 5 feet 5 inches, possibly due to a childhood bout of mumps, but fierce in his determination. He despised team sports, but loved individual challenges. He began developing extreme self-discipline, riding his bicycle 100 miles in a day, practicing with firearms until he became a crack shot, giving up meat for years, deliberately depriving himself of sleep. It was as if he was training for some future trial only he could see coming. His obsession was the medieval world, the age of knights, crusaders, codes of honor, men who lived and died by principle. He collected brass rubbings of memorial plates, hung them on his bedroom walls, images of warriors from centuries past. He read constantly about castles, fortifications, military architecture. This was not idle hobby. This was Lawrence constructing the framework of the man he wanted to become. A modern knight, honorable, self-denying, capable of enduring any hardship. In 1907, he won a scholarship to Jesus College, Oxford, studying history. His focus narrowed: the Crusades, the military architecture of the Middle East, the clash between Christianity and Islam centuries before. For his undergraduate thesis, he needed to examine actual Crusader castles. So, in the summer of 1909, at 21 years old, Lawrence did something extraordinary. He traveled alone, mostly on foot, through what is now Lebanon, Syria, Israel, and Jordan, covering over 1,000 miles in brutal heat, visiting clause after castle, measuring, photographing, understanding. He was robbed. He was beaten. He caught malaria. He slept wherever someone would offer him space. He walked through regions where bandits killed travelers for their boots. And according to his own accounts, he had a marvelous time. This journey changed him. He began learning Arabic. He encountered Arab people not as abstractions in history books, but as living, breathing humans, with their own codes of honor, their own complexities. The desert called to something in him. Perhaps it was the vastness, the emptiness that matched the void he felt inside. Perhaps it was the simplicity. In the desert, a man could be judged purely by his endurance, his courage, his word. His thesis, submitted in 1910, was brilliant. He argued, contrary to prevailing academic opinion, that Western Crusader castle design influenced Eastern architecture, not the other way around. He graduated with first-class honors. The academic world opened before him. Magdalen College offered him a position, a senior demiship, enabling him to continue his archaeological career. This should have been the path: scholar, teacher, quiet life in Oxford's halls. But the desert had claimed him. The East was calling. In 1911, Lawrence joined an archaeological expedition to Carchemish, an ancient Hittite city near the Euphrates River, on what is now the Turkish-Syrian border. Under the direction of David George Hogarth and later Leonard Woolley, two giants of Middle Eastern archaeology. Lawrence spent the next 3 years excavating, discovering, living among the local workers. It was here, in the dust and heat of Carchemish, that Lawrence found something he had never known in Oxford: belonging. Chapter 3. The Archaeologist in the Desert. Carchemish was more than an archaeological site. It was a crucible. Lawrence arrived as a scholar with romantic notions about the medieval past. He left as something else entirely, a man transformed by the land, the language, and the people. The work was brutal. Long days under the merciless Syrian sun, digging through layers of history, uncovering the remnants of a civilization that had flourished 3,000 years before. But Lawrence thrived. His slight frame proved deceptive. He possessed freakish endurance, the product of years of self-imposed physical trials. While others wilted in the heat, Lawrence pushed harder, worked longer, testing his limits. He adopted local customs, learned to live on little food and less water. He began wearing a mix of Western and Arab clothing, Oxford blazer and shorts with a Kurdish sash, later transitioning to more traditional Arab dress. It was theatrical, yes, but also practical. And perhaps it was something more. Lawrence finding a way to become someone other than the illegitimate son of Sir Thomas Chapman. At Carchemish, Lawrence met Dahum, a water boy, perhaps 13 or 14 years old when they first encountered each other. Sources give his name as Salim Ahmed or Selim Ahmed, but Lawrence called him Dahum, meaning darkness, an ironic nickname for a boy with unusually light skin. Their relationship has been debated endlessly by historians and biographers. Was it sexual? Was it romantic? Was it simply friendship? Lawrence taught Dahum to read and write. They worked side by side at the dig. Lawrence brought Dahum to England for a visit in 1913. He would later dedicate 7 Pillars of Wisdom to S.A. Salim Ahmed, though Dahum would die of typhus in 1916, never knowing the role he would play in history's remembering of Lawrence. What seems clear is this: in Dahum, Lawrence found companionship free from the complications of his English life. No questions about his legitimacy, no Victorian morality, no expectations. Just a friendship built in the ancient dust of Carchemish, under the same sun that had witnessed countless civilizations rise and fall. During these years, Lawrence's Arabic became fluent. He traveled extensively through the region, visiting villages, talking with tribal leaders, understanding the intricate web of alliances and blood feuds that governed Bedouin life. He learned to navigate the social codes, when to show deference, when to show strength, how to drink bitter coffee in a sheikh's tent, how to negotiate, how to earn respect. He also learned the language of warfare. The Bedouin tribes were martial cultures, carrying on feuds and raids that had continued for centuries. Lawrence absorbed their tactics, mobility, surprise, intimate knowledge of terrain. He did not yet know he was preparing for war, but the desert was teaching him, day by day, how to survive, and how to fight in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Beneath the archaeological work lay something else: espionage. In 1914, Lawrence and Woolley, along with Captain S.F. Newcomb, conducted what was ostensibly a scientific expedition for the Palestine Exploration Fund. They surveyed northern Sinai, from Gaza to Aqaba, creating detailed maps. The work had authentic scholarly value. Their study was published as The Wilderness of Zin. But it was also a military reconnaissance of the Turkish frontier east of Suez, gathering intelligence that would prove invaluable once war came. Lawrence was becoming a spy without fully admitting it to himself. The scholar and the soldier were merging, creating something new. A man who understood both the abstract strategies of war and the practical realities of desert survival. Then, in August 1914, the world caught fire. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo triggered a chain reaction of alliances, ultimatums, and mobilizations. Europe plunged into World War I. The Ottoman Empire, controlling much of the Middle East, allied itself with Germany and Austria-Hungary against Britain, France, and Russia. Suddenly, the Middle East, Lawrence's beloved desert became a strategic battleground. Lawrence was 26 years old. His archaeological career ended in an instant. The scholar became a soldier, but not the kind of soldier anyone expected. Chapter 4. The Call to War. The War Office in London needed men who understood the Middle East, who spoke Arabic, who could navigate the labyrinth of tribal politics. Lawrence was one of very few such men. In December 1914, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant and assigned to the geographical section of the War Office, working on maps. It was desk work, pushing pins and drawing lines. Lawrence hated it. But Cairo needed him. The Military Intelligence Department in Cairo, soon to be formalized as the Arab Bureau, required men who could gather information about Ottoman troop movements, assess the loyalty of various Arab tribes, and identify potential weaknesses in Turkish defenses. In December 1914, Lawrence was sent to Cairo. At first, it was more of the same. Office work, intelligence analysis, writing reports. Lawrence chafed at the bureaucracy, the slowness, the distance from actual events. He wanted to be in the field, not behind a desk. But the British command was cautious. This was not the Western Front, where massive armies clashed in trenches. This was a different kind of war, requiring different skills. Egypt, officially neutral but effectively a British protectorate, was the base for operations against the Ottomans. The Suez Canal represented a vital lifeline to India and the Eastern Empire. If the Ottomans seized it, British power in the region would collapse. Early in 1915, the Turks attacked the canal. They were repulsed, but the threat remained real. Meanwhile, within the Ottoman Empire, tensions simmered. Arab populations had long resented Turkish rule. The Young Turk Revolution of 1908 had initially promised reform and decentralization, but those promises had curdled into increased centralization and Turkish nationalism. Arab leaders began considering rebellion. Sharif Hussein bin Ali, the Emir of Mecca and guardian of Islam's holiest sites, began secret correspondence with the British. The letters, exchanged between Hussein and Sir Henry McMahon, the British High Commissioner in Egypt, outlined a potential deal. If the Arabs revolted against Ottoman rule, the British would support the creation of an independent Arab state after the war. The exact boundaries remained vague, deliberately so, but the promise was made. In June 1916, the Arab revolt began. Hussein's sons, Ali, Abdullah, Faisal, and Zayd, led Arab forces in attacks on Ottoman garrisons in the Hejaz, the region along the Red Sea coast of Arabia. The revolt started with the seizure of Mecca, then spread to the ports of Jeddah and other coastal cities. The British provided gold, weapons, and advisors, but the revolt struggled. The Arabs lacked military training, modern weapons, and coordination. The Ottomans, though stretched thin by fighting on multiple fronts, still held strong positions, particularly in Medina, a city sacred to Islam. Ottoman General Fakhri Pasha commanded a garrison of 12,000 troops there, and they were not surrendering. Lawrence watched from Cairo, analyzing reports, drawing conclusions. He believed the revolt could succeed, but only if the British provided better support and if the right Arab leader could be found to coordinate the disparate tribal forces. In October 1916, Lawrence's moment came. He was sent to Arabia on an intelligence mission led by Ronald Stores, with orders to assess the revolt's progress and determine whether British ground troops should be committed. Lawrence traveled to the Hejaz and met Hussein's sons. Abdullah was too clever, too political. Ali was too clean, too concerned with propriety. Zayd was too young, too cool-headed. But then Lawrence met Faisal. Faisal bin Hussein, 31 years old, tall and charismatic, possessed what Lawrence immediately recognized as the necessary fire. He had the respect of the tribes, the tactical sense to command irregular fighters, and the vision to see beyond tribal feuds to a larger Arab nation. It was, as Lawrence later wrote, the beginning of a friendship built on trust, warmth, and a shared dream to lead the revolt into Syria. Lawrence recommended against sending British ground troops. Instead, he argued for gold to pay the tribes, weapons to arm them, technical advisors to help with logistics, and air support to target Ottoman positions. The British should enable the Arabs to win their own freedom, not win it for them. SF Newcombe was supposed to become Faisal's permanent British liaison, but Newcombe had not yet arrived, and the situation was urgent, so Lawrence stayed. Temporarily, he thought. It would not be temporary. Lawrence found himself at the nexus of a revolution. The scholar who had spent years studying medieval knights was about to become something far more than an academic observer. He was about to become a warrior himself, not in the trenches of France, but in the vast, ancient deserts of Arabia. And in that crucible, Thomas Edward Lawrence would forge a legend that would echo across the 20th century and beyond. Chapter 5. Guerrilla Warfare in the Hijaz. The war in Arabia bore no resemblance to the slaughter consuming Europe. There were no trenches stretching for miles, no artillery barrages pulverizing landscapes into moonscapes, no poison gas drifting across no man's land. The desert war was fought by small groups of men on camels, striking at the weak points of a supply chain that stretched for hundreds of miles. Lawrence understood immediately that conventional warfare would destroy the Arab forces. They lacked the discipline, the training, and the numbers to stand in formation against Ottoman regulars. But they possessed advantages the Ottomans could never match: intimate knowledge of the terrain, mobility, and the ability to disappear into the desert's vastness. The Hijaz Railway became the primary target. Built by the Ottoman Sultan as a symbol of modernization, connecting Damascus in the north to Medina in the south, the railway was a lifeline for Turkish forces. It carried soldiers, supplies, and reinforcements. Without it, the Ottoman garrisons in Arabia would wither and die. Lawrence and Faisal developed a strategy. Do not capture Medina. Instead, keep the Ottoman garrison there pinned down, forcing the Turks to pour resources into defending a city of no strategic value. Attack the railway constantly, disrupting supply lines, forcing the Ottomans to station troops along its entire length to protect it. Turn the railway from an asset into a drain on Ottoman resources. Small raiding parties, sometimes as few as a dozen men, would ride out into the desert, locate an isolated section of track, plant explosives, and vanish before Turkish reinforcements could arrive. Bridges were destroyed, water towers blown up, telegraph wires cut, trains derailed in the middle of nowhere. Lawrence participated in these raids personally. He was not content to plan from headquarters. He needed to feel the camel's motion beneath him, to smell the cordite after an explosion, to see the faces of the men he led. He adopted full Bedouin dress, flowing white robes, a golden head rope securing his keffiyeh. Part of it was practical. European clothing marked him as an outsider. But part of it was deeper. Lawrence was becoming someone else, shedding the illegitimate son of Oxford for the persona of a desert warrior. The Bedouin warriors he fought alongside were unlike any soldiers in the British Army. They followed no formal military code. They raided for plunder as much as ideology. They would fight fiercely for a day, then disappear back to their tents to tend their flocks. Loyalty was personal, tribal, fluid. Promises meant everything. Blood feuds lasted generations. Lawrence learned to navigate this world. He negotiated with sheikhs, sitting cross-legged in tents, drinking bitter coffee, speaking Arabic. He distributed British gold sovereigns, the currency of loyalty. He earned respect not through rank, but through endurance. Riding longer, eating less, pushing harder than the Bedouins expected a pale-skinned Englishman to manage. There were failures. Attempts to coordinate attacks sometimes collapsed when tribes refused to fight alongside traditional enemies. Raiders would loot captured positions instead of securing them. Bedouin warriors would desert en masse if they sensed an operation was failing. But slowly, the campaign gained momentum. Ottoman forces found themselves constantly harassed, unable to move without being attacked. The psychological impact was profound. Turkish soldiers never knew where the next attack would come from. The desert itself became a weapon. Lawrence's philosophy of guerrilla warfare crystallized during this period. He later wrote that theirs should be a war of detachment, using the vast unknown desert as a silent threat, never disclosing themselves until the moment of attack, developing a habit of never engaging the enemy. They would contain the Ottomans not through pitched battles, but through an endless series of pinprick raids that bled Turkish resources dry. In the spring of 1917, the revolt reached a critical juncture. The Arabs controlled the Hijaz coast, but to advance north towards Syria, they needed a secure port closer to the fighting. The port of Wedge had been captured, but it was not enough. To truly threaten Ottoman control of Syria, to link up with General Allenby's advancing forces in Palestine, the Arabs needed Aqaba. Aqaba sat at the northern tip of the Red Sea, at the junction between Arabia, Palestine, and Sinai. It was the last remaining Ottoman port on the Red Sea, and posed a potential threat to the right flank of British forces advancing from Egypt. The Royal Navy had shelled Aqaba from the sea, but the coastal defences were too strong for a direct assault. Lawrence conceived a plan so audacious that many considered it madness. Attack Aqaba from the landward side, from the desert. To do this would require crossing more than 600 miles of some of the harshest terrain in Arabia, including a stretch of desert known as Al-Hul, the Terror. It would require recruiting tribes that had not yet joined the revolt. It would require absolute secrecy. If the Ottomans learned of the plan, they could easily intercept the force. It would require crossing the Nefud Desert, which the Ottomans believed impassable. In other words, it was exactly the kind of impossible operation that, if it succeeded, would change the entire course of the war. The victory of Aqaba was more than military triumph. It was a statement. The Arab revolt was not a minor disturbance, but a genuine military force capable of strategic operations. It was a psychological blow to the Ottomans, who suddenly had to reconsider their entire defensive strategy in the region. And it was personal validation for Lawrence. The scholar-turned-warrior had proven himself not just in planning, but in execution. The Royal Navy could now supply Arab forces through Aqaba. Coordination with General Allenby's northward advance through Palestine became feasible. The entire strategic situation in the Middle East had shifted. But for Lawrence personally, the victory carried the seeds of future torment. He had promised the Arabs independence. He had fought alongside them, bled with them, led them to believe their sacrifices would birth a free Arab nation. Yet he knew, or was beginning to understand, that promises made in the desert would be broken in the diplomatic chambers of Europe. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, signed in secret in 1916, had already carved up the Middle East between British and French spheres of influence. The Arabs, for all their blood and courage, were to be given scraps, not sovereignty. Lawrence was caught between two worlds, the warrior who fought for Arab freedom and the British officer serving an empire with very different plans. The contradiction would eat at him, year by year, until nothing remained but a hollow man in search of oblivion. But in July 1917, none of that had fully crystallized yet. There was still hope. There were still battles to fight, and Damascus, the great prize, still waited in the north. Chapter 6. The Impossible March to Aqaba. On May 9, 1917, Lawrence departed Wedge with a small force. The men who accompanied him read like a roster of legends. Sharif Nazir in tactical command. Auda Abu Tayyi, the greatest warrior of the Howeitat tribe. Nasib al-Bakri and Zaki Drubi, Syrian nationalists. And Mohammed ad-Dailan. Only 17 Agile fighters accompanied them as a core force. Tribal Bedouins would only fight in their own territories, so the plan was to recruit local tribesmen along the way. They carried £20,000 in gold coin. This was not just currency. It was the revolution itself, condensed into weight. Gold could buy loyalty, could turn neutrals into allies, could ensure guides agreed to lead them through territories where death waited behind every rock. The group planned a vast loop to the northeast, deep into the desert, then arcing back toward Aqaba from an unexpected direction. They would travel more than 600 miles through some of the most inhospitable landscape on Earth. Water would be scarce. Food would be whatever they could carry or scavenge. If they miscalculated distances between wells, they would die. The early stages were brutal but manageable. They rode north through Wadi Surhan, a major corridor of communication. Lawrence's body had been hardened by years in the desert, but even he felt the punishment. The sun was a physical weight pressing down. The nights were freezing. Sand worked its way into everything: clothing, food, wounds that would not heal. But something remarkable happened. As they rode, recruiting Hoetat tribesmen with promises and gold, the force began to grow. What had started as a handful became dozens, then hundreds. Tribal warriors saw opportunity, glory, plunder, revenge against Ottoman oppressors, the chance to be part of something larger than themselves. Then came the true test: crossing the Nefud Desert. The Nefud was legend among Bedouins, an expanse of soft sand and brutal heat where men and camels died with regularity. The Ottomans did not believe anyone would attempt to cross it with a military force. That disbelief was Lawrence's greatest weapon. The days blurred into an ordeal of pure endurance. The sand was not the hard-packed gravel of other deserts, but soft, shifting dunes that sapped the camel's strength. The heat exceeded anything Lawrence had experienced. Men's lips cracked and bled. Water rations shrank to sips. Some camels collapsed and had to be abandoned. Lawrence pushed forward, riding through agony, refusing to show weakness. If he faltered, the entire enterprise would collapse. The Bedouin were watching him, measuring him. A European in Arab robes, leading them into hell. If he broke, they would turn back, and the plan would die in the sand. But he did not break. They crossed the Nefud, emerging on the far side as if they had traversed death itself and returned. Near Wadi Surhan, Lawrence did something unexpected. He left the main force and struck north on a reconnaissance mission, covering over 800 miles round trip. He rode toward Damascus itself, meeting with Arab nationalist leaders in secret, counseling them to wait before rising in revolt, to coordinate with the coming attack. He sabotaged a bridge near Ras Baalbek to create the impression of guerrilla activity in the region, causing Ottoman forces to divert 6 battalions from the front line. This reconnaissance yielded intelligence that would prove vital during the later Allied advance into Palestine and Syria. Lawrence mapped routes, identified weak points in Ottoman defenses, assessed which Arab leaders could be trusted. It was a masterpiece of intelligence gathering, conducted alone in enemy territory. By mid-June, he had returned to the main force at Wadi Surhan. The attack on Aqaba was set. The assault required first taking a series of fortified positions inland from Aqaba. The key engagement occurred at Aba el-Lisan, a position held by several hundred Turkish soldiers. On July 2, 1917, Auda Abu Tayyi led a cavalry charge that overran the Ottoman position in brutal, close-quarters fighting. Hundreds of Turkish soldiers were killed. It was not clean warfare, it was desert warfare, savage and unforgiving. With the inland positions secured, the path to Aqaba lay open. The port's guns faced the sea, anticipating a naval assault. They were useless against an attack from the land. On July 6, 1917, Arab forces swept into Aqaba. The Ottoman garrison, caught completely by surprise, surrendered with minimal resistance. Lawrence and his men had done the impossible. They had crossed deserts the enemy thought impassable, recruited tribes the Ottomans believed neutral, and captured a strategically vital port through sheer audacity and endurance. Chapter 7. The Shadow at Deraa, November 1917. The Arab forces were pushing north, coordinating with General Edmund Allenby's offensive through Palestine. Lawrence moved constantly, planning raids, negotiating with tribal leaders, ensuring supplies reached Faisal's army. He was no longer merely an advisor. He had become central to the revolt's success. The Ottoman railway junction at Deraa held strategic importance. Located in what is now southern Syria, it was a hub where railway lines converged. If the Arabs could disrupt operations there during Allenby's advance, Ottoman forces would struggle to reinforce or retreat effectively. Lawrence decided to reconnoiter Deraa personally. According to his own account in 7 Pillars of Wisdom, he disguised himself in Arab clothing and entered the town with an elderly companion named Faris. They intended to survey the approaches to the railway station, assess defenses, and identify vulnerabilities. What happened next remains one of the most disputed episodes in Lawrence's life. Some historians accept his account, others reject it entirely as fabrication. But the story Lawrence told, in multiple versions across different texts and conversations, goes as follows. He was arrested by a Turkish soldier who ignored his companion. Taken to the barracks, he was cleaned up and, in the evening, presented to the Turkish governor, the Bey. The governor called him beautiful and made sexual advances. Lawrence violently rejected them. Enraged, the Bey ordered his guards to beat Lawrence. What followed, according to Lawrence, was systematic torture. He was flogged repeatedly, perhaps as many as 100 lashes. The beatings progressed to sexual assault. Lawrence's account in 7 Pillars includes explicit, disturbing details. The texture of the whip, the sensations of pain, and, most troublingly, his description of a delicious warmth, probably sexual, during the ordeal. Eventually, bloodied and broken, Lawrence was deemed too damaged for the Bey's purposes. He was bandaged and left unguarded. He escaped that night, rejoining Faris and fleeing Deraa. In 7 Pillars, Lawrence wrote, "In Deraa that night, the citadel of my integrity had been irrevocably lost." The debates about this incident are extensive and complex. The son of the Deraa governor later claimed the story was false, noting that Lawrence described his father as having hair when the governor was actually bald. Historian Adrian Greaves points out that Lawrence did not mention the incident for a year after it allegedly occurred, and that his accounts contain inconsistencies. Some suggest Lawrence fabricated the story to explain scars from consensual sadomasochistic practices. Lawrence later arranged for a military colleague to administer beatings, sessions documented and largely accepted as fact by his biographers. Yet other evidence supports something traumatic happening at Deraa. Psychiatrist and biographer John E. Mack argues that the psychological changes in Lawrence after November 1917 are consistent with severe trauma. In private letters, Lawrence alluded to the incident in ways suggesting deep shame and lasting damage. In one conversation reported by intelligence officer Richard Meinertzhagen, though Meinertzhagen's reliability is questioned, Lawrence supposedly said the experience had penetrated his innermost nature, and he lived in constant fear that the true facts would be known. Whether the Deraa incident happened exactly as Lawrence described, happened differently, or was partially or wholly fabricated, may never be known with certainty. But what is undeniable is this. Something changed in Lawrence after November 1917. The man who emerged from Deraa was not the same man who entered it. His writings became darker. His tactics became more ruthless. The warrior who had once taken prisoners began giving orders that showed no mercy. The psychological weight he carried became visible to those around him. He spoke of shame, of having surrendered something essential, of integrity lost. Some biographers interpret the Deraa episode, real or imagined, as Lawrence's attempt to process conflicted sexuality, to find a narrative that explained feelings he could not otherwise articulate. Others see it as genuine trauma that shattered his sense of self. Still others view it as Lawrence crafting mythology, creating a dramatic turning point to explain the moral compromises he was making in service of both the Arab cause and the British Empire. What matters for understanding Lawrence's story is not necessarily the factual accuracy of every detail, but the emotional truth he carried forward. Whether the event happened as described or not, Lawrence believed he had been broken at Deraa. He believed he had lost something irreplaceable, and that belief shaped everything that followed. 10 months later, Lawrence would return to Deraa, and when he did, the violence he unleashed would carry the bitter taste of vengeance. Chapter 8. The March to Damascus. By 1918, the war's momentum had shifted decisively. The Ottoman Empire, fighting on multiple fronts, was collapsing. General Allenby's forces had captured Jerusalem on December 9, 1917, entering the Holy City on foot to show reverence. Now Allenby prepared for the final push north into Syria. The Arab forces, under Faisal with Lawrence as liaison and tactical advisor, coordinated their operations with Allenby's campaign. The strategy remained consistent: harass Ottoman supply lines, force the Turks to divert resources to defend the Hijaz Railway, and prevent Turkish reinforcements from reaching the main battle lines. Lawrence continued his railway sabotage campaign with increasing sophistication. He developed techniques for destroying not just the track but bridges and installations in ways that maximized disruption. Rather than completely destroying a bridge, he would damage it just enough that the Ottomans would have to demolish it themselves before attempting repairs, wasting precious time and resources. The raids grew bolder. Lawrence led attacks on trains carrying soldiers and supplies, operations that combined explosives, ambush tactics, and cavalry charges. These were not clean military engagements. After a train derailment, Bedouin fighters would swarm the wreckage, killing survivors, looting bodies and cargo. The line between warfare and banditry blurred. Lawrence's fame was spreading. American journalist Lowell Thomas had arrived in the Middle East in search of a story with romance and color to sell to audiences back home. He found his man in Lawrence, the blue-eyed Englishman in flowing white robes, blowing up trains in the Arabian desert. Thomas's photographs and publicity would later make Lawrence an international celebrity, a role he would come to despise. But in 1918, Lawrence was focused on a single objective: Damascus, the great prize, the ancient city. If the Arabs could capture Damascus before the British or French did, they could establish a de facto Arab government, strengthening their claim to independence. Allenby understood this and tacitly supported it, seeing Arab administration as preferable to French colonial ambitions. On September 19, 1918, Allenby launched his massive offensive at Jaffa on the Mediterranean coast. The attack caught the Ottomans completely off guard. Within days, Turkish forces were in full retreat, streaming north toward Damascus. Lawrence's task was to cut off that retreat at Deraa, the same railway junction where, according to his account, he had been captured and tortured 10 months earlier. On September 27th, as Lawrence and his forces moved toward Deraa, they came upon the village of Tafas. What they found was horror. The retreating Turks had massacred many of the village's inhabitants. Bodies lay in the streets. The scene was fresh, the blood not yet dried. Lawrence gave an order: no quarter. What followed was not warfare but slaughter. Throughout that day, Arab forces caught up with a retreating Ottoman column of approximately 4,000 soldiers and civilians. They picked it apart, killing systematically, showing no mercy. Turkish soldiers who tried to surrender were cut down. Wounded men were finished where they lay. Lawrence doubled back in the afternoon and discovered that one unit had missed his command and had taken 250 Turks and Germans prisoner. He wrote in his battlefield report, "We turned our Hotchkiss machine gun on the prisoners and made an end of them." In 7 Pillars, he was even more explicit, describing the massacre in detail, the blood, the methodical killing. He wrote that he was continually and bitterly ashamed of his role in the Arab revolt, that they killed and killed, even blowing in the heads of the fallen. This was Lawrence at Deraa, extracting vengeance. This was the warrior unbound by codes of honor he had once cherished. The scholar who had studied medieval chivalry had become something darker, a man who understood that war, stripped of its mythology, was simply organized killing. The Arab forces continued their advance. Ottoman resistance crumbled. Turkish soldiers deserted en masse. The road to Damascus lay open. On October 1st, 1918, Australian light horse troops entered Damascus from one direction. Arab forces under Faisal, with Lawrence among them, entered from another. Who arrived first remains debated. Both Australian and Arab sources claim priority. What is certain is that by day's end, Damascus was no longer under Ottoman control. For Lawrence, riding into Damascus should have been the ultimate triumph. This was the culmination of 2 years of fighting, planning, enduring. The Arabs had captured the great city. The Ottoman Empire's hold on the region was broken. But the victory turned hollow almost immediately. The Arabs attempted to establish a government. Faisal was proclaimed king of Syria, but the city descended into chaos. Essential services failed. Rival factions fought for control. The hospital was a nightmare. Lawrence described walking through wards filled with the dying, the stench overwhelming, medical care non-existent. And hanging over everything was the knowledge that the Sykes-Picot Agreement still existed. France and Britain had already decided Syria's fate. The promises Lawrence had made to the Arabs, promises of independence, of self-determination, were being revealed as lies told by an empire that had never intended to honor them. Lawrence had become trapped in his own legend. He had fought for the Arabs, had led them to believe their blood would purchase freedom. But he was also a British officer, serving an empire with different priorities. The contradiction was tearing him apart. On October 30th, 1918, the Ottoman Empire agreed to an armistice. The fighting was over. The Arabs had won their military victory. But politically, they had already lost. Lawrence remained in Damascus for a short time, helping Faisal establish the fragile Arab administration. But he knew it was temporary. He knew the Europeans would arrive with their maps and their mandates, carving up the Middle East according to their interests, not Arab aspirations. The war was over. Lawrence had survived. He had become a legend, and he had never felt more broken.
Chapter 9. The Betrayal at Versailles. January 1919. The Paris Peace Conference convened to redraw the map of the world. The victorious Allied powers, Britain, France, the United States, and Italy, gathered to divide the spoils, settle scores, and create a new international order from the wreckage of empires. Among the delegates was a small man in flowing Arab robes, walking through the halls of Versailles like a ghost from another world. Lawrence of Arabia had come to fight one more battle. Not with guns and explosives, but with words and principles. He came as part of Emir Faisal's delegation, translating, advising, advocating for the Arab cause. He had helped Faisal craft a speech, delivered in Arabic, that eloquently presented the case for Arab independence. The speech invoked President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, particularly the principle of self-determination, the idea that nations should be governed by their own people's wishes, not colonial powers. Lawrence pinned his hopes on the American delegation. Wilson, an idealist, spoke passionately about rejecting colonialism and allowing peoples to choose their own governments. Surely, Lawrence thought, the Americans would support the Arabs against the imperial ambitions of Britain and France. But realpolitik crushed idealism. France wanted Syria and Lebanon, as promised in the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Britain wanted Palestine and Iraq. The old colonial powers had no intention of allowing Wilson's principles to interfere with their strategic interests. Lawrence found himself in an impossible position. He was part of the British delegation. Sir Mark Sykes, co-author of the very agreement that betrayed the Arabs, was among his colleagues. Yet Lawrence was also fighting for Faisal, trying to overturn the secret deals his own government had made. Other members of the British delegation viewed Lawrence's ambiguous position with suspicion. Some considered him a traitor. Others saw him as a useful tool who could manage Arab expectations. Few understood the psychological weight he carried, the burden of promises he had made to men who trusted him, promises his nation was systematically breaking. Gertrude Bell arrived in Paris on March 7, 1919, to support the Arab cause. She and Lawrence worked closely with Faisal, strategizing, lobbying, trying to find some opening. Bell called Lawrence her beloved boy, but even her considerable diplomatic skills could not change the fundamental reality. The great powers had already decided. On March 20th, the French foreign minister presented France's case for control of Syria, invoking Sykes-Picot as justification. The discussions became heated. Wilson proposed an inter-allied commission to visit Syria and inquire directly what the people wanted. The King Crane Commission, as it became known, did eventually travel to Damascus and found that Syrians overwhelmingly rejected French control. The commission's findings were ignored. France got Syria. Britain got Palestine and Iraq as League of Nations mandates. Colonialism by another name. The promises made to Sharif Hussein, the assurances Lawrence had given to Faisal and countless tribal leaders, were dismissed as wartime expedients, no longer binding now that peace had arrived. Lawrence watched the betrayal unfold, powerless to stop it. He had fought for Arab independence, had believed he was part of something noble. Now he understood the truth.
He had been a tool of empire, helping Britain conquer the Middle East more efficiently than conventional armies could have done. The psychological impact was devastating. Lawrence began referring to himself as having been continually and bitterly ashamed. The laurels offered him, knighthood, honors, official recognition, he rejected. When King George V offered him a knighthood in October 1918, Lawrence declined, telling the king he could not accept honors for work that had ended in betrayal. During the Paris Peace Conference, Lawrence worked on what would become 7 Pillars of Wisdom. He wrote in hotel rooms, in the margins of diplomatic meetings, pouring his war experiences onto paper. The act of writing was both catharsis and torture, reliving the campaigns, the promises made, the trust given and returned, all leading to this betrayal. By December 1919, Lawrence had completed a fair draft of most of the book's 10 sections. Then disaster struck. Travelling by train from Oxford to London, Lawrence changed trains at Reading Station. In the confusion, he left his briefcase containing the manuscript on the platform. By the time he realized his mistake and returned, the briefcase was gone. The manuscript, approximately 250,000 words, 2 years of work, his attempt to make sense of the war and his role in it, was lost. National newspapers publicized the loss, appealing for its return. It never was. Lawrence was forced to begin again, this time working from memory alone. He had destroyed most of his wartime notes after completing the first draft. Now, he had to reconstruct everything. The battles, the desert marches, the conversations, the moral compromises. He wrote the second draft in early 1920, locked in his rooms, reliving the war in his mind. By 1922, he had completed a third, polished version. The act of writing and rewriting 7 Pillars had become its own form of torment, endlessly returning to those years, unable to escape them, unable to find peace in the retelling. The book would not be published commercially until 1926, and then only in an expensive limited edition. Lawrence could not bring himself to profit from the war, could not allow the story to become entertainment for a public that had not bled in the desert. The Paris Peace Conference ended with Lawrence more disillusioned than ever. The Arab revolt had succeeded militarily, but failed politically. The Middle East had been carved into artificial nations, borders drawn by European diplomats with little understanding or care for tribal, ethnic, or religious realities. The consequences of those decisions would reverberate for the next century. Lawrence returned to England a hollow man. The legend of Lawrence of Arabia was growing. Lowell Thomas's publicity lectures in London were drawing massive crowds, making Lawrence an international celebrity. But the man behind the legend wanted only to disappear. Chapter 10. The retreat into anonymity. Fame was a prison. Everywhere Lawrence went, people recognized him. Newspapers wanted interviews, publishers wanted books. The public wanted the romantic hero, the dashing adventurer in white robes. They wanted Lawrence of Arabia, not the broken man who could barely look at himself in the mirror. Lawrence tried to serve the cause one more time. In 1921, Winston Churchill, now colonial secretary, appointed Lawrence as an advisor on Arab affairs. Together they worked to at least partially fulfill the promises made during the war. Lawrence helped establish Faisal as king of Iraq and Abdullah as emir of Transjordan. These were compromises, far from the independent Arab nation Lawrence had envisioned, but at least the Hashemites, who had led the revolt, received some compensation for their blood. But by July 1922, Lawrence had had enough. He resigned from the colonial office. He wanted no more diplomacy, no more politics, no more honors. He wanted to become no one. On August 28, 1922, Lawrence enlisted in the Royal Air Force as aircraftman John Hume Ross. He falsified his documents, lied about his identity. At the recruiting center in Covent Garden, London, he was interviewed by Flying Officer W.E. Johns, who would later become famous as the author of the Biggles adventure novels. Johns suspected something was wrong, rejected Lawrence's application, but Lawrence returned with a written order compelling his acceptance. Even in trying to disappear, Lawrence's connections followed him. He was assigned to the RAF's Cadet College, maintaining aircraft used for training student pilots. For a man who had commanded armies and advised princes, it was menial work. Lawrence loved it. The RAF offered structure without responsibility. labor without decisions, camaraderie without the complications of leadership. He was simply Aircraftman Ross, one among many, fixing engines, polishing equipment, living in barracks with other working-class men. But secrecy is difficult to maintain, especially for someone famous. The press discovered him. In January 1923, newspapers ran stories exposing Lawrence of Arabia, hiding in the RAF. The service discharged him. Desperate to escape public life, Lawrence enlisted in the Royal Tank Corps in March 1923, this time using the name T.E. Shaw, a reference to his friendship with playwright George Bernard Shaw and Shaw's wife, Charlotte, who had become important correspondents and supporters. In 1927, he would legally change his surname to Shaw. The Tank Corps, stationed at Bovington Camp in Dorset, was even more miserable than the RAF. Lawrence hated the work, hated his fellow soldiers, describing them in harsh terms in his private writings, hated the tanks, but he endured it, seeing the hardship as a form of self-imposed penance. During this period, Lawrence purchased a cottage near Bovington Camp, Clouds Hill. It was small, isolated, primitive, no electricity, no running water. He furnished it spartanly, an eating room lined with aluminum foil over asbestos for insulation, a book room with a leather divan, a music room with a gramophone and massive amplifier. Over the door he carved a Greek inscription. Why worry? Clouds Hill became his sanctuary, a place where he could be alone with his books, his music, his thoughts. He invited friends occasionally, but preferred solitude. The cottage had sleeping bags marked meum, mine, for Lawrence, and tuum, yours, for guests. Everything labelled, everything controlled. He wrote during these years not just 7 Pillars, but also The Mint, a raw account of RAF barracks life. The Mint's spare, brutal prose was stylistically opposite to 7 Pillars' elaborate passages. It detailed the dehumanization of military service, the grinding routine, the erasure of individual identity. It was, in its way, Lawrence's attempt to document what he sought, the obliteration of the self. By 1925, Lawrence had lobbied successfully to return to the RAF. The service, recognizing his contributions to designing high-speed rescue boats for seaplane crews, accepted him back. He spent the next decade working on marine craft development, testing boats, writing technical reports. He professed happiness, and perhaps he was, in a limited way. The RAF gave him purpose without glory, work without fame. As Aircraftman Shaw, he was nobody. The irony was profound. The man who had united Arab tribes, who had captured cities, who had dined with prime ministers and kings, found peace only when stripped of all rank and recognition. But the past never releases its grip completely. 7 Pillars of Wisdom was published in various editions between 1922 and 1926. First as an expensive subscriber's edition, later in an abridged form titled Revolt in the Desert. The books were critically acclaimed, solidifying Lawrence's literary reputation. He hated the attention. He corresponded with major literary figures, E.M. Forster, Siegfried Sassoon, Robert Graves, and especially George Bernard Shaw and his wife Charlotte. These letters reveal a man of profound intelligence and equally profound self-loathing, constantly analyzing his motivations, questioning his actions, unable to forgive himself for the compromises of war. Lawrence also translated Homer's Odyssey from ancient Greek into English, a laborious project that allowed him to lose himself in language and mythology. The translation was published in 1932 under the name T.E. Shaw. Even here he avoided the spotlight that followed Lawrence of Arabia. His love of motorcycles intensified during these years. He owned 8 Brough Superior motorcycles at different times, each one nicknamed George, after the designer George Brough. These machines, the Rolls-Royce of motorcycles, costing about £200 each when a cottage could be bought for the same price, were his only indulgence. Lawrence loved speed, loved the danger, loved the focus required to pilot a powerful machine at top velocity along narrow English roads. When my mood gets too hot and I find myself wandering beyond control, he once said, I pull out my motorcycle and hurl it top speed through these unfit roads for hour after hour. It was therapy through controlled danger. a way to feel alive without having to be Lawrence of Arabia. Just a man and a machine and the road.
On February 25, 1935, Lawrence reached the mandatory retirement age for RAF enlistees. He left the service with considerable regret, returning to Clouds Hill to live out whatever remained of his life. He was 46 years old. He had no career, no family, no plan beyond existing in his isolated cottage with his books and music. Friends worried about him. Some tried to draw him back into public life. There was talk, misguided and perhaps apocryphal, of Lawrence mediating between Adolf Hitler and the British government to prevent another war. Whether Lawrence seriously entertained such ideas, or whether friends simply projected hopes onto him, remains unclear. What is certain is that on May 13, 1935, Lawrence rode his Bruff Superior SS 100 to the Wool post office to send a telegram. He was heading back to Clouds Hill, traveling along a familiar road. A dip in the road. Two boys on bicycles, appearing suddenly. The swerve to avoid them. The loss of control. The motorcycle skidding. Lawrence thrown over the handlebars, his body striking the pavement, blood pooling on the road. A witness, Corporal Ernest Catchpole, ran to help. He found Lawrence unconscious, face covered in blood. A passing army truck rushed him to Bovington Camp Hospital. Lawrence never regained consciousness. For 6 days he lay in a hospital bed, the doctors unable to do anything for the compound skull fracture and brain hemorrhage. One of the physicians attending him was Dr. Hugh Cairns, who would later pioneer research into motorcycling head injuries, work that would lead to the widespread adoption of crash helmets. On May 19, 1935, at 8 a.m., Thomas Edward Lawrence died. Chapter 11. The Legend in the Sand. The funeral was held at St. Nicholas Church in Morton, Dorset, on May 21, 1935. Among the mourners, Winston Churchill, who had tried repeatedly to keep Lawrence in public service, literary friends including E.M. Forster, military colleagues from the RAF, and crowds of ordinary people who stood outside, unable to fit in the small church but wanting to pay respects to the legend. Lawrence was buried in Morton Cemetery. His gravestone was simple, bearing just his name and dates. No titles, no honors, no mention of Arabia. Just a scholar who had also been a soldier. But the legend refused to stay buried. Lawrence's life became the subject of intense fascination, debate, and myth-making. Was he a hero who fought for Arab freedom? A British agent who betrayed the Arabs? A brilliant military strategist? A charlatan who exaggerated his role? A repressed homosexual? A masochist? A saint? A liar? The truth, as always, was complex. Lawrence was all these things and none of them. A man of contradictions, driven by forces he barely understood himself. He was the illegitimate son seeking honor, the scholar turned warrior, the champion of Arab independence who served British imperialism, the celebrity who craved obscurity, the man who could not forgive himself for living. His military contributions were undeniable. Lawrence pioneered guerrilla warfare tactics that would influence insurgencies throughout the 20th century. His understanding of irregular warfare, his emphasis on mobility and psychological impact over territorial control, his recognition that a small force with superior intelligence and will could defeat a larger conventional army. These insights became foundational to modern special operations doctrine. The British SAS and SBS trace part of their intellectual lineage to Lawrence's campaigns. His literary legacy endured. 7 Pillars of Wisdom, for all its baroque prose and questionable accuracy in places, remains a masterpiece of war literature. It captured something essential about the experience of combat, the moral ambiguities of leadership, and the psychological cost of violence. It sits alongside works by Homer, Tolstoy, and Remarque as one of the great books about war. But his political legacy is more troubling. The promises he made, that Arab blood would purchase Arab independence, were broken not by him, but by the empires he served. Yet Lawrence became the face of that betrayal. Arab historians and leaders would point to him as the symbol of Western duplicity, the charming Englishman who helped subjugate the Middle East while wearing Arab robes. The modern Middle East was shaped significantly by decisions made in 1919 and 1920, when European powers drew borders that ignored ethnic, religious, and tribal realities. Iraq, Syria, Jordan,
Lebanon. These nations were created by foreign bureaucrats who had never lived in the region. The instability, conflicts, and resentments that followed can be traced directly to those decisions. Lawrence saw it coming. He warned against it, but he could not stop it.
In the decades after his death, Lawrence became a figure of popular culture. The 1962 film Lawrence of Arabia, directed by David Lean and starring Peter O'Toole, cemented his mythic status. The film was epic, beautiful, psychologically complex, and historically questionable. It made Lawrence a household name worldwide, introducing new generations to the legend, if not always the reality. Scholars continued to debate every aspect of his life. Was the Deraa incident real? Was his relationship with Dahum sexual? Did he exaggerate his role in the Arab revolt? How much of Seven Pillars was truth versus self-mythology? The arguments continue, will likely continue forever, because Lawrence himself was so skilled at obscuring the truth, at creating layers of narrative that protect and conceal. Perhaps the most fitting assessment comes from recognizing that Lawrence lived multiple lives simultaneously. The scholar who never stopped reading, the soldier who never stopped fighting, the writer who never stopped refining his art, the ascetic who never stopped punishing himself. He was a man out of time, someone who would have fit better in the medieval world he studied, where knights followed codes of honor and died for principles, than in the 20th century's pragmatic, cynical reality. What remains clear is that T.E. Lawrence, whatever his flaws, whatever the historical disputes, represented something people still hunger for, a figure who refused to accept limitations, who pushed beyond what seemed possible, who fought for ideals even when the world dismissed them as naive. He crossed deserts that killed others. He learned languages and cultures foreign to his upbringing. He led men who had no reason to trust a pale-skinned foreigner. He wrote books that captured the tragedy and grandeur of war. He rejected fame when others would have exploited it. He spent his final years as a mechanic in the RAF, content to be no one special, seeking only to serve and be forgotten. The motorcycles were fitting for him, machines that demanded total focus, that punished any moment of inattention, that offered the illusion of control while hurtling toward the edge of disaster. Lawrence rode them seeking release, seeking the intensity he had known in Arabia, seeking, perhaps, some final test that would either prove his worth or end his torment. On that May morning in 1935, on a quiet Dorset road, the test finally came. Two boys on bicycles, innocent and oblivious, a swerve, a crash, 6 days of silence, and then the end. The man who captured Damascus died, trying to avoid hurting 2 children. There is something profoundly Lawrence in that, the instinct to protect, the sacrifice made for strangers, the recognition that even in the smallest moment, one must try to do what is right, even if it costs everything. His legacy is written in the sands of the Middle East, in the tactics of special forces worldwide, in libraries where 7 pillars of wisdom still speaks to those who seek to understand war and those who wage it. But perhaps his truest legacy is simpler. He showed that one person, armed with courage and will, can change the course of history. Not always for the better, not always in the ways intended, but change it nonetheless. The desert wind still blows across the tracks where Lawrence once rode. The ruins of Ottoman forts still stand in Jordan, silent monuments to battles fought more than a century ago. Clouds Hill still exists, preserved by the National Trust, a small cottage where visitors can stand in the room where Lawrence listened to music and wonder what thoughts occupied his final weeks. And somewhere in the collective memory of humanity, the image persists. A small man in flowing white robes, riding a camel across empty vastness, leading men toward a dream that would not be realized, fighting battles that would not end with victory, seeking redemption that would never fully come. Lawrence of Arabia, the unbroken and the broken, the legend and the man, the hero who could not save himself but tried, always tried, to save others. In the end, perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is all any of us can do. Endure the trials placed before us. Fight for what we believe is right, even when the world conspires against it. And leave behind something, a story, a book, a memory, that others can build upon. The sand remembers what the world forgets,
And in the desert, where Lawrence became who he was always meant to be, the wind still whispers his name. These are not just stories of men and women from distant times. They are echoes of courage that refused to die. Lessons written in blood and perseverance that speak to us still. If T.E. Lawrence's journey moved you, if his struggles, his triumphs, and his unbreakable will sparked something within, then honor that courage by keeping these stories alive. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, share this epic with someone who needs to hear that legends are not born, they are forged in the fires of impossible trials. Because every view, every share, every comment adds fuel to the flame. And these flames must never go out. The next legend, the next story of impossible courage, is already waiting to be told. Stand with us as we bring it to light. Heroes never truly die. They wait in the silence for voices brave enough to speak their names again. Will yours be one of them?